Welcome back to the Amnesia experiment. Today, Jerry will be reading from Chapter 3. Last time you met Laura, who was disturbed by a man in the restaurant. Today, her friend Justin invites himself onto her boat, which turns out to be a submarine. They take the submarine to the Keys, and on the way back they're involved in a violent storm. Later, Justin begins to doubt his own memories of what happened and questions some things about Laura. Thank you, Jerry.
Justin had never been on Laura's boat and was curious to see how she lived. It was anchored in a sheltered cove. A narrow path led down to the single dock. For the first time, he wondered about the wisdom of Laura coming home late from the restaurant. He did notice lights along the path, though, that probably came on at dusk. It was a long pier leading to the boat. He realized she must have inherited a bunch to afford a private spot like this. Her books surely couldn't account for such a setup. The boat sat well in the water. It was sleek and capable looking, just like its owner. The color mimicked the color of the water. He hadn't noticed it from a distance. He'd been focusing on finding his way and occupied with his own thoughts. He felt like an intruder as he knocked on the door. When Laura opened the door, Justin was shocked by her haggard appearance. He gave her a quick hug and then held her at arm's length. "If I didn't know better, I'd think you'd been on a binge." "It's good to see you too." She gave him her best mocking smile and dove into the sack of bagels. "Blueberry with strawberry cream cheese. Aren't we feeling adventurous today?" She divided the spoils and poured the coffee. "Thanks for the goodies." "My pleasure. I could tell you should marry a gourmet cook. You'd be a happy man." "I am a happy man. My best friend works at a gourmet restaurant, and I frequently get freebies. That's good enough for me." He devoted himself to the food and gradually became aware of his surroundings. Everything had a nailed-down industrial look, and strangely foreign. The table where they sat was a gray metal, clearly not stainless steel. He was sure he'd never seen such metal before. There were only 2 bar stools, which were fastened to the floor. The cabinets and countertop were all made from the same material. He didn't see anything he could clearly identify as a stove or refrigerator. There was a large unit in the corner that might hide appliances, but he couldn't see any handles. There was nothing out of place, nothing just lying around. Yet it was surprisingly beautiful. The craftsmanship was top-notch, and the indirect lighting gave the metal a warm glow. He looked at Laura and thought how right she looked here. "This place suits you. Somehow. Efficient, beautiful, mysterious. It must be an instinctual gift. Surely they didn't teach you how to flatter a woman in seminary." "Probably the Irish in me. I've just worked out why you were a waitress." Laura arched an eyebrow and waited for his explanation. "The kitchen isn't made for cooking, at least not that I can tell. I guess my secret's out. I eat out and take out. If I ate like that, I'd be huge. Well, huger. What does it take to get this hunk moving?" "Very little. Come on, I'll show you." Laura led him past what he assumed was a bedroom, bathroom, and den into what appeared to be the control room. Like the kitchen, the room was compact with 2 chairs fastened in place. She sat down in front of the control panel. Justin took the vacant chair and admired the wraparound windows. She pushed a button and dual anchors slid silently into place. She pushed another button and the boat began to thrum gently to life. She expertly swung the boat away from the dock. Justin looked at the control panel and wraparound windows and felt an unfamiliar cramp in his gut. This wasn't like any boat he'd ever seen. Everything was so high-tech, so strange, more like a submarine he'd toured once, only sleeker, smaller, much smaller. If private submarines existed, that's what this would be. Before he could monitor himself, he blurted out, "Your folks must have had a bundle to afford a boat like this." Laura shrugged and said, "I guess, but I only found the 1 bank account. There wasn't much in it." She hesitated, then flashed a genuine smile. "Hence the palms. Not exactly a mental challenge for me, but I enjoy it, and your company." He saw the tension slip away from her face and shoulders as she managed them out into the open ocean. She locked in some coordinates and turned toward him. "You make it look easy." She shrugged, and he noticed her discomfort. but didn't understand why a casual compliment should send the tension racing back into her face. "So how are things going with that gang you're trying to reform? How's Jamie?" He was aware of her diversionary tactics, but he pretended to take the bait. He loved to talk about his work with the street kids and was soon lost in recounting of his efforts on Jamie's behalf, as well as the other boys that seemed so determined to let circumstances dictate their futures. When she began to skirt the quays, she was occupied at the wheel. Justin felt a twinge of conscience at the half-truths he'd spun to win his day of freedom. The bishop was not entirely supportive of his friendship with Laura. He and Laura had discussion about religion that would have alarmed the bishop. She believed in a benevolent power, but no hellfire and brimstone, no judgment, no need for a savior. She believed that after death, when the soul returned to its natural home, it was confronted with a review of its past life and had to plan its reincarnation to improve on past mistakes. Reincarnation was too weird for Justin, but he liked listening to Laura's ideas. It had been a smooth ride to Key West, but Justin was relieved when his sandals hit the pier. He was mildly amused by the covert looks they got as they walked into the town. He was a respectable 6 feet and broad-shouldered. Despite all his time on the basketball court, his gait was heavy-footed. He suspected he looked like a tank charging through space. In contrast, Laura was a foot shorter, but moved with effortless grace that gave the impression of controlled power. An odd couple for sure. You have to try the conch here. I love it, especially the fritters. There's a place just up the way that does them best. Fritters? That's not something we serve at the Palms. I know. He looked down at her and suddenly wasn't sure she'd like them. Do you like spicy food? I'm not sure. I've never tried it. At least I don't think I have. Oh, right. He sucked in his lower lip. He'd forgotten about her amnesia. She'd never seemed troubled by it, but her voice just now had a tremble in it he'd never noticed before. He was relieved when he spotted the restaurant. Here we are. Do you want to sit in or out? Out. We can watch people. Good idea. They found a table and he waved off the proffered menus. The large fritter basket and iced tea for me, Laura. Laura? Tea would be lovely. Thank you. If you don't like the fritters, we'll get a menu. Actually, I'm not hungry. I love the bagels, but don't usually eat that much in the morning. She paused and said, You seem to know this place pretty well. I'm surprised. Yeah, not exactly a priest's hotspot. I came here when I was at state. Before my seminary days, a bunch of us came down some weekends. The fritters arrived, and all thoughts of college days were drowned by the sight of the key lime mustard. He picked up a fritter and dipped it in. He took a bite and closed his eyes in appreciation. Ah, as good as I remembered. Try one. He watched as she broke off a piece and dipped it in the sauce. Her eyes watered as she reached for the tea. When she gained control, she said, That's wonderful and terrible all at the same time. I'm glad I tried it, but you can have the rest. No problem. I'll get you a menu. Please don't. Tea is all I want. Truly, I'll just enjoy watching you. Enjoy. Occasionally, she glanced at him, but mostly she faced the walkway. Her focus was inward. He wondered if she just bored because he was eating and not talking. Reluctantly, he pushed the basket aside and signaled for the check. This surprised Laura, who said, Don't quit because of me. I'm fine just sitting here, really. If I eat anymore, I'll be miserable. Good as it is, I want to see room for a special treat I have planned for us. Justin paid the bill and left a generous tip. I'll bet you never had key lime pie on a stick dipped in chocolate. Key West is the only place you can get such a treat. If you don't like it, I'll eat yours, he said with a sly grin. Justin walked on a ways before he realized Laura wasn't with him. He backtracked and found her on the bench with her head buried in her hands. He assumed the heat had gotten to her, and he rushed to the nearest cafe. By the time he returned with a glass of ice water and a napkin he doused on the run, Laura had regained her equilibrium. She drank the water and pressed the cloth to her face. Thanks, she said as he plopped onto the bench beside her. I don't know what came over me. My fault entirely. It's really too hot for a long walk. Maybe we should head back to the boat. You could rest a while before we weigh anchor. Justin's earlier concerns for Laura reclaimed his thoughts. It was so unusual to see Laura display anything resembling vulnerability. She was the one person in his life that required nothing from him other than friendship. She was never sick. She was never needy. She'd been his friend since the day she had stopped to watch him playing basketball. When he'd walked over to her, she said, "That looks like fun. What are you doing?" He assumed she was making fun of him and challenged her to a game. After a few awkward moments of getting a feel for the ball and how to move on her feet, he didn't stand a chance of beating her one-on-one. He didn't know she'd never played the game. She came by a few more times before inviting him to come to the restaurant with her. His curiosity and the prospect of free food made acceptance easy. He found her mind even more nimble than her ball handling. That had been nearly 5 years ago. Seeing her apparent physical vulnerability now confused him. Laura brought him back to the present. "Not to worry," she said. "I'm fine now. Starting back is a good idea, though. I think we're in for a storm." Justin looked up at the clear and cloudless sky. "We are? Must be a seamanship internal radar thing." By the time they reached the boat, the first wisps of clouds began streaming past. The horizon became a little less distinct. Justin watched uneasily as Laura put her eye to the scanner and heard the click of the lock. Unaccountably, he felt a finger of fear run along his spine. Laura was already inside, so he followed her in and said, "Are you sure we should set out if a storm is coming? It might be safer back in town." "The vessel is completely safe," she assured him, as she threw her sunglasses on the table. "Vessel?" Laura laughed a little self-consciously. "Yes, I suppose vessel. Does sound a bit pretentious. I just meant to make you feel confident in its ability to get us home safely." Justin was still debating with himself about the advisability of setting out on an approaching storm, when he realized Laura wasn't with him. He found her in the control room pushing buttons, and he warily looked at the wrap-around windows. He hoped they wouldn't encounter lightning. That might be a bit unnerving. Laura flashed him a conspiratorial smile, and somewhere anchors silently retracted into the hold. He sank onto a chair and tried to appear relaxed. The boat began to rock, gently at first, then more insistently, as the sky darkened. Lights winked out and paused before coming back on. "Should we turn back?" he suggested. "Too late for that." Justin moved to stand near Laura. "I think I'd better stay here in case you need help." Just then, the boat lurched and threw Justin across the cabin. He struggled to stand and make his way to Laura. He reached her side as another wave struck and they both crashed onto the floor. With no one at the controls, the boat began to rock violently. Justin looked up for something to grab onto and pull himself up. There was a bench just out of reach. He tried rolling over toward it, but the boat pitched again and threw him against the wall where he lost consciousness. The boat sank below the raging waters. It sat there patient as a cat, as a mouse hole. Justin woke with a start and saw Laura standing over him. He remembered the violent storm and falling. He didn't remember reaching the chair or anything afterward. He could feel the boat steady beneath him. The storm was gone. He looked into Laura's face as she bent over him. He thought he remembered her carrying him to the chair, strapping him in, touching his forehead, but that was impossible. It must have been a dream. She smiled at him, and his world shifted back into place. "I'm afraid I slept and left you to handle the storm. How could I do such a thing? Some help I am." He unbuckled the strap as Laura stepped aside. "What time is it?" He looked at his watch and answered himself. "Nearly 4 o'clock. How can that be? I've never slept like that during the day." "The storm? You just let me sleep through it? You must have had a really rough time of it." He stood up, trying to compute all the information that seemed utterly incredible. Laura looked away from him and at the approaching skyline. He thought she must be too angry to speak. "I seem to have slept too," she said. "I didn't handle the boat. Whatever happened, happened without me. We were just looked after somehow." Justin gave a low whistle. "You mean we've both been out of it, sleeping while a storm raged?" He sat back down again. He couldn't believe it. One part of him suspected Laura was lying to make him feel better. Another part of him believed her, or believed perhaps it was a miracle. "Is the boat okay?" "As far as I can tell, it handles well, and somehow we stayed on course." Her voice was strained. Her shoulders tensed. He sensed she was as disturbed by the events of the last few hours as he was. They made the remainder of the trip in silence. Justin mentally gave thanks for their safety in the storm. He tried to dismiss the memory of Laura bending over him just before he slept, and again on waking, rather like a mother watching over a child. He smiled at the absurdity of the idea. He assumed they were about the same age. She'd never mentioned a birthday. Once they were celebrating his, he'd asked her, and she replied, "That's not something we celebrate." He picked up on the way "we" immediately, because she never talked about her family. When he questioned her about it, she denied it, said he misunderstood, but he knew what he'd heard. He might have pressed the point, but she'd become very still, as if something in her had shut down. Now here he was once again, feeling like a child in her presence, feeling shut out. She claimed not to know what happened. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe God had sheltered them in the storm. He felt good believing that, rather as if he'd had a mystical experience. That was his initial reaction. He tried to cling to it. What other possible explanation could there be? Maybe she'd simply piloted them through it. She seemed enormously tense for someone who had slept through a miracle. He also noticed that nothing now seemed out of place. He'd been thrown across the room, yet nothing now was thrown about. That could easily be explained, he realized. There wasn't anything in the room that wasn't nailed down or built in. "Will you have trouble because we are gone so long?" Laura asked. Justin knew he might have some explaining to do. He told the bishop he didn't feel up to the youth center today. He was due a day off and was going to see a friend. Even though the bishop didn't encourage his friendship with Laura, he didn't forbid it. He probably hoped his displeasure would be enough to discourage the friendship. However, Justin was not an ambitious priest. He didn't want to advance through the ranks. He didn't want to get lost in the administrative duties. He liked working with young people, steering them away from the wasted lives, even if he didn't convert them. In this, he also disappointed the bishop. So what exactly could he tell him about this day's adventures? Not the truth, certainly. Assuming he even knew the truth. If Key West came up in the discussion, he would infer that they had left after the storm was over. He could only hope the storm hadn't hit land with anything like the fierceness he'd felt at sea. Justin watched Laura expertly dock her boat and cut the power. "I suppose I'll never get you out on this boat again," she said, "even for the chocolate-covered key lime pie on a stick that you've never got." Justin laughed. He was relieved to be safely back. He was amazed and confused by his experience, and he was anxious about facing the bishop. "I don't know. I think whatever happened only occurs once in a lifetime. I've had my adventure. Next time she'll be smooth sailing, just not right away." He gave her a quick hug. "Take care and get some rest." Laura watched Justin's taillights retreating down the lane and wondered if she would ever see him again. And what would he think of her when he had time to reflect on what had happened? Would he even remember anything? He scuffed off her sandals and sat down on the pier to dangle her feet in the water. She couldn't bear the thought of going back inside. She was terrified to go to sleep, to dream, to see more visions like she had this afternoon. The city underwater, seaweed clinging to buildings, no people, no fish. She'd felt the tragedy, remembered it was a scene from her book, but somehow real, more like a memory. And the voices in her head, "Remember us, Laura, remember, remember." Being awake was almost worse. She didn't want to think about what had happened. A part of her mind knew she had done something to the ship and to Justin, but she shied away from the memory. That must have been part of the dream. It couldn't be real. But how could they survive such a storm? How could they both sleep through it? There had to be a logical explanation. There must be something about the boat that made it possible. There was something in that closed-off part of her brain that understood the simplest thing would be to examine the boat. The first place to check out was the control panel. She headed back inside. She avoided touching the buttons, but she looked at them. They had symbols she didn't understand. One looked like a closed, elongated circle reminiscent of the shape of the boat. The other symbol was the same shape, but the circle broken open at the top and bottom. She stretched a finger toward the buttons, but a strong compulsion forbade her to touch them. She tried to open-ended button and found she could push it, but nothing happened. Totally frustrated, she stumbled back out and sank down onto the deck. She pounded her fists again, the unforgiving surface, until pain shot up her arms and shocked her out of her tantrum. She stood and looked across the bay. Seeing the water calmed her. She was Laura. That meant something. There was an explanation for everything, Even the dreams. She must be patient. She would figure it out.
Thank you, Jerry. Next time, David will bump into his old friend HB at the airport. HB turns out to be someone really important in Laura's life. Please join us next time.